Now the other thing, lastly, that I want to show you is that this type, it looks fine, but if you want to make it look a little bit more like the heading up here, then we can do that. Okay, so let's go ahead and jump back over to our CSS. And now I think what we want to do, I'm going to go up here right after the H1 span. I'm going to make a new rule for H2. And first of all, let's go ahead and make the color for it. Okay, so let's say the color is going to be, and then you could use a color picker. I know that somewhere in the ballpark of like F90 as the shorthand, F90 is shorthand for the approximately the color of orange that I want. So if I save that and I hit refresh, you can see that wow, that's super bright. Well, okay, now if you wanted to go into Photoshop, you could use the color picker to get the exact hexadecimal number that you want. The other thing that I could do too is to make this a little bit more, stand out a little bit more, is that I could also make it a little bit bolder. So if you remember, if you look back into our index and you go all the way up, you can see for the Google API, for the Google fonts, we have weights of 400, 300, and 700 that are going to load for us. So what I could do is I could also go here and I could say font weight, okay, and then I could tell it to be 700, like that. Let's save that, refresh it. It's a little bit heavier, but really what I think I also need is I also need something like a drop shadow on it. But you might be wondering, well, how am I going to do a drop shadow if I'm not using an image file? Well, if you remember, we've done an example of this before with CSS3. You can still do a drop shadow. And I'm going to show you a really simple resource that you can use. I'm going to open a new tab. And I'm going to just paste in the address. It's css3generator.com. And if you aren't sure how to write something, then you can go and, do like text shadow, for instance, and you can play around with the different links, and you can see your preview here, and you can play around with the, let's do 1 pixel, 1 pixel, maybe 2 pixels, and then let's put in sort of a gray color. You can also type in a hexadecimal number if you know what you want. So let's say 333, 333, which is sort of a dark gray, like a charcoal color, and then you can start to see what it's going to do. And then what you can do is you can copy this by clicking the little clipboard, copy that like that, and it'll tell you it's copied. And then you can come back over here to your code and you can paste it in, and it will go ahead and it'll set you up so that you've got things that will work in different browsers. And you can also change these to ems. They don't have to be pixels, but let's just see what happens here, and you can also adjust that. Let's save this, and let's go back to our thing here, and let's hit refresh. And you can see that now it does in fact have that drop shadow, so it's a little easier to see, but still it's not that easy. Like, maybe if there was another color back behind it. See, even like whenever I highlight it, it looks better. So I kind of think I like the idea of having sort of more of a sky blue back behind it. And what you would want to do then is you would want to give it a background color. So you're going to say background, and then in this case I would probably do like an RGBA. So let's do RGBA like this, and then we'll go ahead and put our values in. Now, one of the things I've already done is I went ahead in Photoshop and I found the color that I wanted, but what you can do specifically is you can, if you have Photoshop, you can use this, or you can do some other kind of color picker, is you could go to the color picker, and by the way, to do that, you can just double click the foreground color over here, pick the color you want with the slider, and then what you want to do is look at the values here for R, G, and B. Okay, you're not going to be using the hexadecimal value this time, so you need 78, 176, and 252. Let's see if I can remember those. So we'll say 78. I think the next one was 176, and then 252. And then lastly, don't forget you have to put the percentage that you want it. Let's see for right now what it looks like at, I don't know, let's say 0.9, so 90%. And let's go ahead and save that. And notice also that it's giving me this green line. That means that there's a syntax error. And it's not just because it's tabbed in. It doesn't like this for some reason. If I hover it, it tells me that there's an error in parsing the value for filter. Well, if it seems to throw off your page in any of the browsers, then you might want to go ahead and just comment this out. But this was, I believe that this one is for Internet Explorer, but let's just go ahead and save it and see how it behaves. Okay, so let's hit refresh, and in fact it gives us that blue color, but I want it to be a lot more transparent than that. Let's see what happens if I go down to maybe about, I don't know, 45%. Let's see what that does. Hit refresh. That's a much better color, and actually now I can read the words pretty well with that drop shadow and so on. It looks pretty good. Now the only problem is that I would like for these corners to be rounded similarly to the other corners that are rounded, and then also I'm going to have to deal with the padding for hip trips because I need more space inside of this H2 area so that my text doesn't feel so crowded. So what I can do now is under the H2 I can go down to border radius. I can type border radius like this, and let's say maybe about 12 pixels, somewhere in that range. And then also let's go ahead and give this thing padding. So let's just start maybe with, I don't know, somewhere in the ballpark of 3%. And let's hit refresh. And that looks a little bit better. Now the only thing that I'm a little concerned about is if I scroll down, I'm sort of the mind that the paragraph text shouldn't come any further left of the actual margin of the heading. So I think that the paragraph text should probably have at least the same margin as does the heading level 2. So let's go back in there, and down below we can go ahead and add at the very bottom a rule for the paragraphs, and we can tell it to be padding. Well, let's just do 3% all the way around. Save that. Let's hit refresh. And I think that that feels a little bit less crammed in there. Now, one last thing is that, you know, originally I looked at this title and I thought that it was okay, and you know, it just seems a little bit too vibrant to me. It still vibrates too much, especially if I look at my original one where I sort of made the drop shadow a little bit more distributed and spread out. And if I do something similar to that here, that might help. The other thing is I might want to knock this orange down so that it's not quite so bright. So what I could do if I wanted to do that, first of all, let's look at the orange, and let's go back to Photoshop and let's look at that color picker, and let's jump into the range of the orange. And what you can also do here is you can move Photoshop over so that your color picker is a little bit closer, and then you can get a little bit closer to the actual color somewhere in this range of the text up here. So let's just see what happens if we do this. It's not, maybe a little bit brighter possibly than the title, but maybe it needs to be just a tiny bit brighter. So let's copy that first of all, and then let's go into our CSS for the H2, and where it says color, I'm going to change it to that. Let's save it, and let's do a refresh and see if that helps a little bit. And it might help a little bit, but I still think that we need to adjust the shadow. Okay, so let's go back into the CSS and we can adjust, where is it, right here, the text shadow. So we could try something like maybe 2, and blur it 3 pixels, see if it's a little bit fuzzier, save it, hit a refresh. That's a little bit dark, that's a little bit heavy. The other thing too that you can do if you don't want to do it in pixels is you can do it in ems, and you can have a little bit easier time with getting the in-between numbers. So let's say that we want to do this, instead of doing it in pixels, let's change this. Let's change this so that we've got like maybe, I don't know, let's even do a negative value. So let's do it in ems, and maybe we'll do, I don't know, 0.05 in ems and a positive value, and then maybe like a 30% or 0.3 0.3M, which is sort of like a 30% blur. So save that and see how that looks. And that's a little bit better. So it's a little bit, in fact it's identical, I think, pretty close to it for the original. And that one's a little bit easier to read. You could still make it a little bit darker by maybe making the blur not so great. If you wanted to not blur it too much, it would be a little bit darker. Anyway, so that gives you an idea of how you can style this stuff and make something that is scalable and still looks good at pretty much any screen dimension. I mean, this doesn't necessarily look the greatest. This is something that would start to happen like on a phone, possibly. So there's some other ways that you could deal with responsive design, but we're not going to talk about that right now. This is enough for this demonstration, and this should really give you a good idea of how to deal with images, how to style them, how to create them, how to place them, what the differences are between the different types, and when and why you would use the different ones. Okay? All right. That's the end of it, and get going on your own work.